In the autumn of 1909, a doctor at a children's asylum in upstate New York wrote a single sentence in his logbook, and then he never wrote in that book again. The sentence was about two boys, twin brothers, 7 years old, who had been placed in separate rooms on opposite sides of a thick brick wall. According to the doctor, the boys had never once been allowed to see each other. They had never shared a room, never eaten at the same table, never played in the same yard, and yet every single night the staff heard them talking. Not shouting, not crying, whispering. Long, calm, patient conversations through the wall, in a language none of the nurses recognized. When the doctor finally pressed his own ear to the cold brick and listened, he claimed the twins were not speaking nonsense at all. They were describing a city with towers of red stone and streets that glowed without fire. A city they both seemed to remember, even though neither of them had ever lived anywhere but that asylum. But the strangest part was not what they remembered. It was that they both agreed, in that quiet whisper through the wall. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. That all of it had been taken from them on purpose, and it was taken from you too. You just don't remember it yet. To understand how two orphaned boys ended up whispering the same impossible memory through a wall, you have to understand where they came from, and the truth is, nobody really knows. The Verrick twins arrived at the Holloway County Children's Home in the spring of 1908, with no papers, no relatives, and no story anyone could verify. A record book that still exists lists them simply as Ambrose and Elias Verrick, age 6, place of origin unknown. The line where a parent's name should go was left blank. The line for the town they came from just says the single word, West. That word mattered more than the clerk who wrote it could have known, because in 1908 an enormous number of children were moving from west to east and east to west across this country in a way that has never been fully explained. Between the 1850s and the late 1920s, an estimated 200,000 children were loaded onto trains in the crowded cities of the East Coast and shipped out across the continent to be handed to strangers. History books call these the orphan trains. They tell you it was charity. They tell you these were the abandoned children of immigrants, cleaned up and given a fresh start on farms out west. However, when you actually look at the numbers, something does not add up. The cities did not have enough recorded births to produce that many orphans. The paperwork for where these children came from is thin to the point of being almost non-existent, and a strange share of them, when they grew old enough to speak clearly about it, described the same thing the Verrick twins would later whisper through their wall. They remembered somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere that felt like home in a way the farm never did. The twins were different from the other children from the very first day. The matron who received them wrote that they did not cry when they were separated from whoever had dropped them off. They did not ask for their mother. They simply looked around the great stone building, at the high ceilings and the arched windows, and one of them said, out loud, "This one is still standing." The matron thought it was a strange thing for a child to say. She wrote it down because it unsettled her. She did not know she was writing down the first clue. Holloway County Children's Home was not a new building. It had been a poorhouse before that, and before that, the local story went, it had been something grander that nobody could quite name. A hotel, some said. A sanatorium, said others. A few of the older residents in the town insisted it had been built long before the county was even founded, and that the people who first settled the area had simply moved into it, the way you move into a house someone else already built. The architecture did not match anything else for 100 miles. It had domes. It had ornamental stonework that no local mason could have carved. It had a heating system running through the walls that nobody living could explain and nobody had ever installed. And it had that wall. The thick, interior brick wall that separated the two rooms where the twins were placed. The staff had not chosen those rooms at random. The twins were separated on the orders of a visiting physician named Dr. Cornelius Bly, who examined them shortly after they arrived and recommended, in writing, that the brothers be kept apart at all times. His stated reason was that the boys shared what he called a morbid dependency, an unhealthy closeness, and that separating them would help them develop as individuals. That was the official reason, but Dr. Bligh's private notes, which surfaced decades later, tell a very different story about why he wanted that wall between them. Bligh had encountered twins before in his career, and he had a theory that he did not dare publish. He believed that certain twins were not two people at all, but one memory split across two bodies. He believed that when they were together, they reinforced each other, and that what they remembered together became too strong, too detailed, too resistant to what he called correction. Keep them apart, and the memory would fade. That was the plan. That was always the plan, with all of them. Separate the children, scatter them across a continent, put an ocean of farmland between siblings, and let the old memory die quietly in the dark. It should have worked. It worked on almost everyone. But Dr. Bligh made one mistake. He assumed a wall would be enough to keep the twins apart. He did not account for the fact that the twins had never needed to see each other to speak. And he certainly did not account for what was inside the wall itself. For the first few months, the nightly whispering was dismissed as ordinary. Children talk after lights out. The nurses assumed the boys had simply figured out that the brick carried sound and were murmuring to each other the way any lonely brothers would. Nobody bothered to listen closely. Why would they? But in the winter of 1908, a night nurse named Eloise Hartman started keeping a private diary of what she heard because she could not sleep and because the things coming through that wall had begun to frighten her. Hartman's diary is the reason we know any of this. She wrote that the twins never spoke about the asylum, or the food, or the other children, or any of the small things you would expect two little boys to whisper about. Instead, night after night, they described a place, and they described it in perfect agreement, one adding detail to what the other said, as if they were both looking at the same painting from slightly different angles. Ambrose would describe a river of white stone bridges. Elias would add that the bridges hummed when you walked across them. Ambrose would describe a great fair with buildings taller than any church, all made of the same pale marble, glowing from the inside at night. Elias would say that after the fair ended, men came and tore the buildings down, and that this was wrong, because the buildings had not been built for the fair at all. The buildings had been there first. The fair had just been an excuse. Now, that detail is the one that should stop you cold, because it points directly at something that actually happened over and over in the real historical record. Between the 1870s and the 1910s, the great cities of the world held a series of enormous exhibitions, World's Fairs. They were staggering in scale. The one in Chicago in 1893 covered 600 acres and featured hundreds of massive white neoclassical buildings, an entire gleaming city that observers at the time called the White City. 200,000 people would visit in a single day. And here is the part they gloss over. Almost all of it was demolished immediately afterward. The official story is that these were temporary structures made of a plaster and fibre material built to be torn down. But the photographs do not look temporary. The photographs show domes and colonnades and vaulted halls with the proportions of buildings meant to stand for 1,000 years. They show electric lighting on a scale that supposedly did not exist yet. They show a fully functioning city, complete with a transit system and a power plant, assembled in a couple of years by a workforce that, on paper, did not have the technology to build it. And then, once the crowds went home, they knocked it all down and told everyone it was always meant to be temporary. Elias Verrick, 7 years old, whispering through a brick wall, said it plainly. The buildings had been there first. The fair was just an excuse to explain why they existed, right before the excuse to tear them down. Nurse Hartman did not know any of this. She was not a historian. She was a tired woman writing down the ramblings of two little boys because they made her afraid to close her eyes. But she was a careful writer, and she recorded exactly what she heard, and it is her carefulness that lets us line the whispers up against the record 100 years later and watch them match. It is worth slowing down here to sit with exactly what the twins claim to remember, because the specifics are what separate this from a simple ghost story. Hartman's diary preserves dozens of these nightly descriptions, and read together they form something closer to a map than a fantasy. The twins remembered a world lit without flame, Elias described lamps that held a steady white light with no wick and no oil, mounted on iron poles along every avenue, and he insisted the light came out of the air itself, drawn down through the poles the way water is drawn up through a root. Ambrose remembered that the great buildings did the same thing, that they were not merely lit from within but somehow charged, that standing near their walls made the hair on his arms rise and left a taste like copper on his tongue. They remembered water everywhere. Canals instead of roads in the older districts, wide channels of clear water crossed by those humming stone bridges, and boats that moved without oars or sails or engines, gliding on the current as if the water already knew where they wanted to go. Ambrose said the canals had been filled in by the inheritors, packed with earth and paved over, and that if you dug down beneath certain streets you would find the old channel still there, dry now, waiting. He named the shape of the oldest cities too, and this is one of the details that has unsettled people the most. He said the great cities were built as stars, not square, not round, but as many pointed stars, with walls that zigzagged out into sharp points and back again, ringed by moats of that same clear water. He was 7 years old, in an asylum in rural New York in 1909, and he had almost certainly never seen a map of the fortified star cities that were built across Europe and Asia and the Americas in the centuries before. But those cities exist. They are documented, photographed, still standing in dozens of countries, laid out in exactly the many-pointed star shape the boy described through a brick wall. The official history says they were military fortifications, designed so that defenders could fire on attackers from every angle. It is a reasonable explanation. It just does not explain why so many of them were raised in places that were never attacked, or why the star shape turns up in street plans that have no walls at all, or how a child who had never seen one could describe their geometry in the dark. The twins remembered sound as well. Not just the humming bridges, but a low tone that ran underneath the whole city, a note so deep you felt it in your chest rather than heard it with your ears. Elias said the tone came from the buildings, that the domes and the towers were shaped the way they were on purpose, to catch that note and hold it and pass it along, so that the entire city rang like the inside of a bell that never quite stopped being struck. He said the note was what kept everything running. The lights, the boats, the warmth in the walls. And he said that when the levelling came, the first thing that died was the tone. The city went silent before it went dark, and the silence, he told his brother, was worse than the mud. By the early months of 1909, the whispers had changed. The twins were no longer just remembering, they were explaining. And what they were explaining, in that patient little voice through the wall, was how a whole world had been ended and covered up. They called it the levelling. Not a war, not a plague, not a flood in the way we think of floods. A levelling. Ambrose described it to Elias as if reminding him of something they had both lived through, and one of them had started to forget. He said the mud came first. He said it came up from below and down from the sky at the same time, and it filled the streets to the height of a man's shoulders, and it hardened. He said that afterward the beautiful red towers and the glowing streets were half buried, and that the people who came after, the new people, did not dig them out. They built on top. They filled the lower floors with dirt and called them basements. They took the grand buildings that were still standing and said, "We built these," when they had done no such thing. This is the heart of it. This is the memory the wall could not kill. And once you have heard it, you start to see it everywhere. You walk down an old street in an old city, and you notice the buildings whose ground floor windows are half below the level of the sidewalk. You notice the churches whose original doors now open onto a wall of earth. You notice that the oldest layer of nearly every ancient city on the planet is buried, and that the official explanation, that cities simply rise over time as debris accumulates, has never quite explained why the rise is so sudden, so uniform, and so global. The twins had a word for the new people, too, the ones who came after the mud and took credit for the buildings. Elias called them the inheritors. He said they were not evil, exactly. Most of them genuinely believed they had built the world they woke up in. Only a few at the very top knew the truth, and those few made it their life's work to keep everyone else from remembering. That, according to the whispers, was the real reason for the trains, the real reason for the asylums, The real reason 2 little boys had been dropped off with no papers and no past and split up by a wall. The children remembered. And the children had to be scattered before the memory could spread. Dr. Bly, it turns out, agreed with them completely. He just happened to be on the other side. We know this because of what Bly wrote in his private journal during those same months, a journal that his own grandson found in an attic in the 1970s and did not understand for years. Bly wrote about the Verrick twins by name. He wrote that they were, in his words, the strongest case he had ever encountered, and that separation was not working. He wrote that most children who arrived carrying what he called the old recollection could be broken of it within a year, through routine, through discipline, through simply drowning the memory in the boring hours of institutional life until it slid out of reach. But not these 2. Every morning, the twins woke up more certain than the night before, and Bly understood why. The wall between them was not silencing the memory. The wall was carrying it, because that heating system running through the walls of the old building, the one nobody had installed and nobody could explain, was still active in ways the staff did not understand. The pipes, or the channels, or whatever ran through that ancient brick, carried more than warmth. They carried sound in a way ordinary walls do not. When the twins whispered against the brick, their voices did not just pass through 6 inches of masonry. They travelled the whole length of the building's hidden veins and came back changed, layered, doubled, as if the wall were whispering along with them. Hartman wrote about this. She said that on the coldest nights, when the pipes were fullest, she could hear not 2 voices through the wall but many. A murmur underneath the twins, like a crowd agreeing with them in a language older than the boys' own. Hartman devoted more pages to the resonance than to anything else, because it was the one thing she could not explain away, a child's fantasy she could dismiss. 2 brothers comforting each other through a wall she could understand. But the sound underneath them was not a child, and it was not comfort. She described nights when the cold pressed the pipes full, and the whole old wing seemed to lean in to listen. The whisper of the twins would begin, low and even, and then, beneath it, the wall itself would take up the rhythm, a murmur with no source, layered and doubled, as though the building were repeating the boys back to themselves in 100 older voices. She swore the voices underneath spoke the same language the twins spoke, the one no nurse recognized, and that on the worst nights she could almost understand it, the way you can almost read a word in a dream just before it dissolves. She went to Bly with it once. She told him what she heard, and she wrote that the doctor did not call her foolish, did not tell her she was overtired or imagining things. He went very still, and he asked her a single question. He asked whether the voices underneath were answering the boys, or asking them something. When she could not say, he told her to stop listening at the wall, in a voice she described as more frightened than stern. She understood, much later, what the question meant. Bly was not afraid the building was talking to the twins. He was afraid it was learning from them. He was afraid that a structure which had stood silent for however many decades, its lower floors packed with earth, its great notes stilled by the levelling, was being woken back up, one whisper at a time, by 2 children who still remembered how it was meant to sound. Bly called it resonance. He believed the building itself remembered, and that the twins had simply plugged into it, the way you might touch 2 wires together and complete a circuit. Separate the boys and it should have gone quiet. Instead, the old building had become a 3rd voice in the conversation, and it was on the children's side. So Bly changed his plan. If the wall could not silence them, the wall had to go. In the spring of 1909, he ordered the twins moved out of the old wing entirely, into a newer annex built in ordinary wood and plaster, with no ancient veins running through it, no resonance, nothing to carry the memory. And for a few weeks, it seemed to work. Hartman recorded that the nightly whispering stopped. The boys grew quiet. They grew pale. They stopped eating well. Ambrose, the one who always led the descriptions, began to forget details he had been certain of a month before. It was working exactly the way Bly wanted. The memory was finally dying. But it turned out the twins were not the only ones who had been listening. The other children in the home had heard the whispers too. Not the specifics, not through the wall, but in the yard, in the dormitories, in the quiet moments when children talk to each other about the things adults tell them not to. The Verrick twins had spent a year telling the others what they remembered, and memory, it seems, is contagious. By the time Bly moved the twins to the annex, a dozen other children in that home had started remembering things of their own, small things. A girl who had never seen the ocean described the smell of a harbour city that no longer existed. A boy drew, over and over, a symbol he could not explain, a six-pointed star inside a circle that matched the ornamental stonework carved above the old building's main door. The memory had jumped the wall the twins were supposed to be trapped behind. It was loose in the building now. Bly panicked. His journal from this period is frantic, the handwriting deteriorating, the entries getting shorter and darker. He wrote that he had underestimated the twins entirely. He had thought he was dealing with two carriers of an old memory. What he was actually dealing with was two children who could teach the memory to anyone. And in an institution full of the exact kind of children the system had worked so hard to empty of their past, that was the most dangerous thing imaginable. He used a phrase in one of the last legible entries that has haunted everyone who has read it since. He wrote, "They are not remembering the world. They are rebuilding it, one child at a time." That is where the record starts to break. Because in the summer of 1909, something happened at the Holloway County Children's Home, and the official documentation of it is almost comically thin. There is a report of a fire. There is a report of an outbreak of fever. There are two different death certificates for two different children who do not appear to have existed before that summer. And there is a work order, signed by Dr. Bly, for the demolition of the old wing. The ancient wing, the one with the walls that remembered. It was torn down that August, and the ancient stone was hauled away and, according to the county records, used as fill for a road that was being built to the east. They ground the memory into gravel and paved over it. Hartman's diary lingers, in its final pages, on the bond between the two boys, and it is here that the story stops being an investigation and becomes something closer to a tragedy. She wrote that in all her time at the asylum she never once saw the twins together. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Because they were never allowed to be. Everything they shared through 6 inches of brick. They learned each other's voices without ever learning each other's faces as they grew, so that each boy carried a brother who was, in a sense, only ever a sound in the dark. And yet Hartman believed they were closer than any two people she had ever known. When one of them fell sick, the other would go quiet and pale in his own room, on the far side of the wall, without being told. When one of them dreamed, the other seemed to wake from the same dream. They were not two boys keeping each other company, she wrote. They were one person, divided by an architecture built to divide them, refusing to be divided. That is what makes the last separation so hard to read. They had survived the wall by turning it into a telephone. They had survived the demolition of the old wing by carrying the memory inside each other. The only way left to break them was to make the distance too great for any wall to carry, and so they came for Ambrose, and they took him to the trains. Hartman wrote that on the morning he left, the two boys were allowed, for the first and only time in their lives, to stand in the same room, only for a few minutes, to say goodbye. She was there. And she wrote that they did not embrace, and they did not cry, and they barely spoke at all. They simply stood and looked at each other, two identical faces meeting properly for the first time, as if quietly confirming something they had always known was true. Then Ambrose was led out to the wagon, and Elias was taken back to his room, and the wall between them widened until it was the whole breadth of a continent. As for the twins, the story we can reconstruct from Hartman's diary and Bly's journal, and a scattering of county paperwork, goes like this. When the old wing came down, the resonance that had been feeding the memory ended for good. The twins, in their plain wooden annex, went silent for real. And then, in September of 1909, they were separated in the most final way possible. Ambrose was sent west on a train, to a family in a farming town that Hartman was never told the name of. Elias was kept behind, alone, and Hartman wrote that in the days after his brother left, the boy did not speak a single word to anyone. Not to her, not to the other children, not to the doctors. The one connection they could not sever, they finally severed by putting 1,000 miles of New World farmland between two little boys. That should have been the end of it. That was how it ended for 200,000 other children. Scattered, silenced, absorbed. But on the last night, before the whispering stopped forever, Nurse Hartman pressed her ear to the wall of Elias's room one final time, because she could not help herself, and she heard him whispering, alone, to a brother who was already gone, already on a train heading into the sunset, already too far away to answer. And what she wrote down that night is the single sentence Dr. Bly copied into his own logbook before he closed it and never opened it again. It is the sentence this whole story turns on. Elias, 7 years old, alone in the dark, whispered to a brother who could not hear him. He said, "They can bury it, but they can't make us forget we're standing on it." And then he never spoke again. For most of the 20th century, the Verrick twins were a footnote, if they were anything at all. Hartman's diary sat in a family attic. Bly's journal sat in another. The county records burned in a courthouse fire in 1931, which is convenient or coincidental, depending on how much of this you are willing to believe. The story might have vanished completely, the way the memory itself was supposed to vanish, if not for a strange convergence in the 1970s, when Bly's grandson and Hartman's granddaughter, who had never met and lived 4 states apart, both independently began trying to make sense of the documents their families had left behind. Bly's grandson was a skeptic. He assumed his grandfather had been a cruel and possibly deranged man running a brutal institution, and he expected the journal to confirm it. Instead, the deeper he read, the more he realized that his grandfather had not been the villain of the story so much as a low-ranking soldier in a war he only half understood. Bly took his orders from somewhere. He referred, again and again, to a body he called only the Committee, which reviewed the intake of children across dozens of institutions and flagged the ones who arrived, in their language, still carrying. Bly was not inventing the program of separation and erasure, he was administering it. And when he began to suspect that the memory the committee was so desperate to bury might actually be true, when 2 7-year-old boys started rebuilding a lost civilization one whisper at a time in his own asylum, he did not have the courage to switch sides. He tore down the wall instead. The committee is the piece of this that people most want to be false, because it is the piece that turns a private tragedy into something far larger, and yet it is the piece Bly documents most plainly, because he worked for it. He never names its members. He refers to it only by that one word, always capitalized, the committee, the way a man refers to a thing he is afraid to write down more clearly. But he describes its function in detail. It reviewed intake. It received reports from institutions all across the country, thin summaries of every child who arrived without papers, and it flagged the ones whose behavior matched a certain profile. The profile was not illness. It was memory. Children who spoke of a place they could not possibly have known. Children who drew the star. Children who used the old words. Those children were marked, and the marked children were separated, scattered, and watched. Bly writes that he attended a single meeting of the committee, in a city he does not name, in a building he describes only as very old and very grand, with a domed ceiling and a strange warmth living in the walls. He does not seem to notice, or does not allow himself to notice, that he is describing the same kind of building he spent his whole career emptying of memory. At that meeting he was told the purpose of the work in the plainest terms he ever set down. He was told that a memory shared by enough people at once stops being a memory and becomes a claim on the buildings, a claim on the land, a claim on the history itself. And a civilization that has quietly taken possession of another civilization's world cannot afford to let the true owners remember they were ever robbed. Scatter the ones who remember, the committee told him, and the claim can never be filed. That was the whole of it. Not cruelty for its own sake, bookkeeping. The oldest and coldest kind of theft, the kind that begins by destroying the receipt. Hartman's granddaughter came at it from the opposite direction. She had grown up hearing family stories about a great-grandmother who had worked in an old asylum and gone strange in the head, who used to insist that the world was younger than it looked and that the beautiful old buildings had been built by people nobody was allowed to talk about. The family treated it as dementia, but when the granddaughter finally read the actual diary, in Hartman's own careful hand, she found no dementia at all. She found a meticulous, sane, terrified record of a woman listening at a wall and writing down exactly what she heard, night after night, for the better part of a year. When the two of them found each other and laid the journal beside the diary, the documents did something that neither family had expected. They agreed. Bly, writing from the side, trying to bury the memory, and Hartman, writing from the side, trying to preserve it, described the same events, the same dates, the same twins, the same impossible city of red stone and glowing streets and buried lower floors. Two hostile witnesses, one story. And the story was that in the autumn of 1909, in a demolished wing of a building that no longer exists, two children came within a hair's breadth of teaching a whole generation of orphans to remember a world that had been deliberately erased, and were stopped by a doctor who tore down the very wall that was carrying the truth. The Verrick twins were not the only ones, and this is the part that turns a strange story into something much harder to wave away. When Bly's grandson began cross-referencing the names in the journal against other institutional records from the same decade, he found that the committee his grandfather answered to had flagged children in at least a dozen other homes, scattered across several states, and that a handful of those flagged children had left faint records of their own. In a home outside Cleveland, a girl named Marta, intake year 1907, was noted by a matron for drawing the same symbol again and again, a six-pointed star inside a circle, and for insisting she had lived in a city beside a great inland sea, where the towers were red and the street lamps burned without fire. In an asylum in Pennsylvania, twin sisters, left unnamed in the surviving paperwork, were separated on the recommendation of a visiting physician for reasons that echo Bly's own language almost word for word: a morbid closeness, an unhealthy shared recollection. A boy in a home near the northern border told a caretaker that the mud had come twice, once very long ago and once more recently, and that the second time was smaller but had finished the job the first one started. None of these children knew one another. They were hundreds of miles apart, most of them unable to read or write, far too young to coordinate anything, and separated by the very system that had gathered them up. And yet they remembered the same city, drew the same symbol, described the same catastrophe, and reached for the same handful of words. Red towers, lights without fire, the mud, the levelling, the inheritors. If it was a fantasy, it was a fantasy that 100 scattered children somehow shared right down to the vocabulary, without ever meeting. And if it was a memory, then the only question that truly matters is whose memory it was, and why so many children arrived carrying it at the very same moment in history, right as the last great buildings of the old world were being pulled down and rebranded as the temporary halls of a fair. Now here is where a careful person has to slow down, because it would be easy to get carried away. There is a version of this story where you accept every detail: the mud that fell from the sky, the humming bridges, the great white city that was standing before the fair, the committee, the resonating walls, all of it, at face value. And there is a version where you dismiss all of it as the fantasy of two frightened children and the credulous adults who wrote them down. The interesting thing, the thing that keeps people up at night, is that neither version is comfortable, because the mundane details in these documents are real. The orphan trains were real. 200,000 children were moved with paperwork so thin it barely exists. The world's fairs were real, and they really did build entire gleaming cities and tear them down almost overnight. The buried lower floors are real. You can walk into old districts of old cities right now and see the windows below the sidewalk, the doors that open onto earth, the ground floors that were somehow always basements. The official history has an explanation for each of these things. The orphan trains were charity. The fairs were temporary by design. The buried floors are the natural result of cities rising over centuries of accumulated debris. Each explanation, taken alone, is reasonable. But the Verrick twins whispered a single story that ties all of them together into one pattern, and that is the thing the official history cannot do. It has a separate, comfortable answer for each piece, and no answer at all for why the pieces fit. Return, for a moment, to the fair, because Elias kept returning to it, and the more he said, the more precise it became. He described a fair that everyone came to see, a fair the whole world was invited to, with a white city of domes and colonnades built along a shining stretch of water. And he described what happened once the crowds had come. He said that while people were still marveling, men were already measuring the buildings for demolition. He said the fair was never really about wonder, it was about permission. You gather the whole world to look at the beautiful old city one last time. You call it a marvel of modern engineering. You let everyone photograph it and write about it, and then you take it down. And now every person who ever saw it will swear it was built for the fair, because they watched it come down when the fair ended. The demolition is the alibi. The wonder is the cover. And the truth, that the buildings had stood on that spot for longer than anyone alive could say, gets buried under a million cheerful postcards of a summer everyone remembers fondly and no one remembers correctly. The historical record does not contradict him, it simply frames it differently. The great expositions really did assemble entire monumental cities in a year or two, with materials and methods that historians still describe as astonishing. They really were demolished almost immediately on the stated grounds that they had always been temporary. The photographs really do show electrical lighting, vast domed interiors, and neoclassical stonework at a scale and finish that sits uneasily beside the official story of a young country still finding its feet. Every fact is accounted for. Only the pattern is orphaned, and the twins, whispering through their wall, were describing the pattern the facts refused to name. That is what makes this so hard to let go of. It is not the ghost story. It is not the humming bridges or the six-pointed star. It is the uncomfortable fact that if you wanted to erase the memory of a lost civilization, if you actually sat down and planned it, the plan would look almost exactly like the real, documented history of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You would move the children who remembered, so they could not compare notes. You would bury the lower floors and rename them basements. You would let the last great buildings stand, but attach them to a fair, so that when you tore most of them down, no one asked where they had come from. You would flood the record with a new story, printed in a million school books, until the new story was the only one anyone could recall. And you would fail, in exactly one way. You would fail with the twins, because you can scatter siblings across a continent, but you cannot scatter a memory that lives in two bodies at once. You can tear down a wall, but not before it has whispered to everyone in the building. You can grind the ancient stone into gravel and pave a road with it, but then the road remembers, and every cart that rolls east over that gravel is rolling over the last physical trace of a world that officially never existed. The question everyone eventually asks is, what happened to them, to Ambrose and to Elias? And the honest answer is that the record goes quiet, in a way that is either tragic or sinister, and you will have to decide which. Ambrose Verrick, sent west in September of 1909, appears exactly once more in any document anyone has found. A census taker in a farming county recorded, in 1910, a boy of that name and roughly that age living with a family whose own children were all accounted for elsewhere. After that, nothing. No death certificate, no marriage record, no gravestone anyone has located. He simply stops. Boys did not simply stop in the census of that era unless someone made them stop. His trail ends the way the ancient wing ended, abruptly, with the paperwork just slightly too thin. Elias stayed at Halloway until the institution closed its doors in 1914, and here the story takes its final strange turn. According to the last surviving staff record, Elias Verrick, who had not spoken a word since the night his brother left, walked out of that building on the day it closed, 12 years old, and was not enrolled anywhere else, not fostered, not sent on another train, not recorded as deceased. He walked east, on foot, following, if the county map is to be believed, the exact line of the road that had been built with the ground-up stone of the old wing. A silent boy, walking east down a road paved with the bones of the world he remembered, and then he too is gone from every record we have. Hartman wrote one last entry about him, months after she had left the asylum, when she happened to be passing back through the town. She claimed she saw a young man standing at the edge of the road where the old wing used to be, looking at the empty lot where it had stood. She could not be sure it was him. But she wrote that as she passed, he turned toward her, and that although he did not speak, she understood him perfectly, the way you understand something in a dream. And what she understood, standing on that road, was a single thought, arriving in her mind in a voice that was not quite her own. It said, "We are still here. We are underneath everything. And one day the mud will give us back." She never saw him again. She closed the diary that night, and for 60 years it stayed closed, in an attic, until a granddaughter opened it, and the whole thing came whispering back through time the way the twins came whispering through the wall. So what do we actually have when we set aside the fear and lay it all out flat? We have 2 children who arrive from nowhere with a memory they should not have had. We have a doctor who spent his career burying that exact kind of memory in that exact kind of child, and who left behind a journal admitting the program was real. We have a nurse who wrote down, in real time, a description of a lost civilization that lines up, detail by detail, with the strangest unexplained features of our own documented history. We have a building that was demolished the moment the memory it carried grew too strong. And we have 2 boys who walked out of the record entirely, in opposite directions, and were never seen again. It is possible that all of it is a story. Children invent, adults embellish, families mythologize, and 100 years of retelling can turn a sad little tale of 2 orphans into a cosmic secret. That is the safe conclusion, and it might even be the correct one. But the safe conclusion has to explain away an awful lot. It has to explain the paperwork that is always just slightly too thin. It has to explain the buildings below the sidewalk and the fairs that were torn down overnight and the children who kept remembering a home that no school book admits ever existed. It has to explain why the leveling the twins described looks, from a certain angle, exactly like the world we live in, built on top of something older that we have all agreed not to see. There is one more possibility, and it is the one which sits least comfortably of all. It is possible that the memory the twins carried is real, but not in the way a conspiracy would have it, not a cabinet of deliberate lies guarded by a shadowy committee, but something more human. Civilizations really do fall, hard and fast, and the survivors really do move into the buildings left standing and come to believe they built it all. In that version, there is no committee. There is only us, doing to our own past what we have always done, and 2 children who simply could not stop seeing the thing the rest of us agreed to stop seeing. There is a name for the world the twins remembered, though neither of them ever used it, because it had been scrubbed from the schoolrooms before they were born. On the old maps, the ones printed before the great tidying of the histories, an enormous portion of the northern world carries a single word, Tartary, or Grand Tartary, a realm stretching across the top of the entire continent, larger than any empire the modern books admit ever existed. It appears on map after map, drawn by careful cartographers who were not in the habit of inventing continents, and then, within a few decades, it vanishes, not conquered, not renamed piece by piece the way ordinary empires fade. It simply disappears from the maps, all at once, replaced by a scatter of smaller names, as if a whole civilization had been quietly edited out of the record between one printing and the next. The comfortable explanation is that Tartary was never a country at all, only a vague European word for a region full of many different peoples, a label of ignorance rather than a real empire. Perhaps, but it is a strange kind of ignorance that draws consistent borders, names consistent cities, and records consistent flags across the work of dozens of independent mapmakers over 200 years, and then agrees, all at once, to forget. The twins did not know the word, but they described its ruins. Red towers across a northern plain, a civilization of light and water and sound, levelled by mud, and inherited by strangers who paved over its lower floors and signed their own names to its buildings. Whatever you choose to call it, the twins remembered it, and the maps, before they were corrected, remembered it too. Maybe the twins were wrong. Maybe they were 2 frightened boys filling the dark with a beautiful lie, because the truth of being an orphan in 1909 was too much to bear, and inventing a stolen kingdom is easier than admitting no one came for you. That is a kinder explanation, in its way, but it does not account for the wall that whispered back. It does not account for the resonance Hartman heard on the coldest nights, the crowd murmuring underneath the boys in a language older than the boys themselves. It does not account for a doctor, a hardened administrator of erasure, breaking down in his own journal and writing that these two children were not remembering the world, they were rebuilding it. And it does not account for the simplest, most disturbing detail of all, the one Elias whispered on his last night, alone, to a brother who was already gone. They can bury it, but they can't make us forget we're standing on it. Because if you have ever stood in an old part of an old city and looked down at a window set below the level of the street and felt, for just a second, a strange and unearned certainty that the ground you are standing on used to be somewhere else entirely, then some part of you has heard the whisper too. It comes up through the soles of your feet, through the pavement, through whatever they ground up and used to bury the last of it. It is very quiet and very old, and it is saying exactly what Elias said. We are still here. We are underneath everything. Think about that road for a moment. The one built east out of Holloway County in the autumn of 1909, paved with the ground-up stone of a wing that should never have come down. Somewhere in that gravel are the fragments of the wall that whispered, the pipes that carried the resonance, the carved six-pointed star from above the old door, crushed now into pieces too small for anyone to recognize. They took the one physical object that was actively carrying the memory, they broke it into gravel, and they laid it flat beneath a public road, so that the whole county would spend the next 100 years driving back and forth over the buried remains of the thing they were not permitted to remember. If you wanted a single image for how the old world was handled, you could not invent a better one, not hidden in a vault, not locked away in a cellar, ground up and spread out and walked on, in plain sight, until no one could see it any more because everyone was standing on it. And a silent 12-year-old boy walked down that exact road, on foot, following the crushed remains of his own memory east toward the sea, and stepped quietly out of history. Maybe he died in a ditch, one anonymous orphan among thousands, and the story ends the way most orphan stories really end, without ceremony and without justice. Or maybe he was doing the thing Hartman thought she understood on the day she saw him standing at the empty lot. Maybe he was not leaving at all. Maybe he was gathering, following the scattered stone the way you would follow a trail of crumbs home, collecting the pieces of the broken wall, the only way that was left to him, in memory, in mind, carrying the whole of it east toward wherever the ones who still remembered were meant to gather. On the day, enough of them finally woke at once. The Verrick twins were separated, then by a demolition, then by a continent, and finally by time itself. Everything that could be done to keep them from remembering was done, thoroughly and deliberately, by people who understood exactly what was at stake. And still, more than 100 years later, here you are, hearing their whisper, which means the one thing the wall was built to stop is the one thing that is happening right now, in you. They remembered. And now, so do you. The only question left is what you are going to do with a memory that was never supposed to survive. Because somewhere under the road that runs east out of a town that no longer keeps its records, under the gravel that used to be a wall, under the basements that used to be ground floors, the old world is still lying there, in the hardened mud, exactly where the inheritors left it, patient, buried, waiting for enough people to remember at the same time. The twins started the fire with a single whisper through a single wall. Whether it spreads is not up to them anymore. It is up to whoever is still listening. And you were listening. You were listening this whole time.